welcome to the Craft House Magic Set of Tutorials. Today I'm going to show you how I bind a quilt, and this is actually my advent calendar that I started on in a tutorial a couple of weeks ago. I'll pop a link down below if you want to see how I did the pockets on these. First of all, to do the binding, I want to trim the edges off of the backing, the wadding, down to the same size as the front panel. So I tend to use my rotary cutter and ruler to trim that down. So that it's a lot quicker this way. Although some people don't like cutting wadding on a board, I don't find it too bad. Some people don't like leaving little bits of fluffy wadding into their board, but most of the time, because your backing fabric is between the wadding and the cutting board, you don't get that. I normally do my binding the very last minute, but I will actually go back and do these pockets later. I have actually quilted around the edge here, so it's sort of stabilised the edges before I put the binding on. So what I've done is I've cut enough 2-inch strips so that I know that it will have plenty to go around the edge of the quilt. I think I've cut 3 widths of the fabric here. So when you're making binding normally, you might cut it on the bias, but these are actually just in line opposite to the selvage, if that makes sense. Because we're just doing straight binding, if I was going to go around corners, I'd definitely do bias binding. But I've cut 2-inch strips so that there's plenty to go around the edge of the quilt. And then I'm going to sew these pieces together. So I'm going to sew these 2 ends of binding together. If you've got a fabric that has a right side and a wrong side, you need to make sure that you put your right sides together for this. But these fabrics that I'm using are actually just the same on both sides. They're solid, so it doesn't matter. So I'll place one strip over the other one so that the edges are flush together. And then I'm going to stitch from this corner to the corner over here where they join. I'll show you in a little bit more detail when I've stitched it. So there we are. I have stitched the 2 pieces together so that when you open it up, it's a continuous piece, if that makes sense. So that you can see I've stitched from the corner here to this corner here, like as if there's where they overlap is a square, and I'm stitching corner to corner. So the next thing I'm going to do is to trim this seam to 1/4 inch over at the cutting board. There we go. So I'm literally cutting the fabric 1/4 inch from this stitch line so that you don't have all this excess fabric. There we go. So I'll join a couple of pieces together so that I know that there's enough to go round the length of the fabric, and I've already done so. So here I can trim off my 1/4 inch seam. Then I'm going to go to the ironing board and press this. So here's where I've trimmed my seam. I'm going to set the seam now. And I'm going to open this out. And open the seam out at the back as well. Carefully finger press it open and then give it a press to make sure that you've got your seams open out like this so it reduces the bulk. And then what you want to do is you want to press all the way along your fabric so that it's folded in half like so. Like that. So I will go ahead and press the whole length of my binding in half like this. So I've pressed So I've pressed the length of the fabric in half, making sure that my seams are on the inside. Now we're going to go over to the machine and start stitching it to the quilt. So we've got the panel here. What you need to do is have the raw edge of the fabric and you're going to line it up with the edge of your quilt. I suggest you leave about 10 inches before you start stitching and go about halfway onto the side of the quilt. And I'm actually going to stitch this straight to the quilt without pinning it, because I find it tends to ruck up anyway and I'll have to rearrange the corners when I get to them. So let's get this under the machine. So I have a special attachment on my machine which is like a walking foot. So if you've got a walking foot you can put it on here. So I've lined up the point where the edge of my binding and my quilt are meeting, and I've got about 10 inches extra binding on that edge. And then I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch so that I'm almost at the corner here. So I'm going to stitch to about there and then I'll stop and arrange the corner piece. So as I'm stitching I'm going to be making sure that both edges of the binding and the quilt are lined up. So I'm coming up to this corner, I'm going to fold the material away so that it's the shape of a mitered corner, and then fold the material back on itself so it forms a nice little pleat here. Making sure that my edges are lined on both sides here and here, and then I pull the little triangle towards me and I'm going to stitch to 1/4 of an inch from this edge. I'm then going to stitch off diagonally off the corner. I've lifted my foot. I'm not going to pull the work away from the needle too much because that thread is still attached, but I'm going to push this little triangle to the top so that where you're going to stitch here it's not going to stitch back onto itself, if that makes sense. And then I'm going to stitch back up the diagonal, making sure that this binding is aligned with the edge of the quilt at all times, and then I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch all the way along this edge. And I'll do the same with all 4 corners. So this is back to where I started stitching the binding on in the first place. I want to stitch to about 8 inches from where I started stitching it on in the first place. So I'm going to stitch to about here. So there we are. I've stitched the binding on all the way around and left about an 8 to 10 inch gap there. And now we're going to trim these ends so that we can actually join them together so that you can't see where the join is. So I'm going to cut one side of the binding so that it's about in the middle where you've just left the gap, and make sure that that's at a right angle there. So you take your binding from the other side and place it over the top so that they're both flush with the edge of the quilt. Then I'm going to get my little ruler and then I can just about see where the edge of where I've cut is. So I'm going to cut the binding coming from the other direction 2 inches. So there we go. So there's a 2 inch overlap on those 2 pieces. So if I was to use a binding that was 2.5 inches wide, this distance, I'd then leave a 2.5 inch overlap, if that makes sense. So the width of your binding, you leave the overlap the same. So I'm going to take this now over to the sewing machine and show you the next bit. So we have our 2 ends here, and I've carefully unfolded one of the pieces and do the same with the other one. Now you want to make sure that you put right sides together on this bit, and then we're going to cross these 2 over, and I find it easier just to pull the back bit out the way, and then it's easier just to get a couple of pins into this so that you can it isn't so fiddly. So I've folded the quilt over out the way so that the 2 points where they're already sewn are closer together, so it doesn't pull on these 2 pieces of fabric, if that makes sense. And then I'm going to stitch diagonally like we did when we were joining the binding. So theoretically, joining it here will be the same join as we did on the other bits of binding. So that's that bit. The larger the gap you leave between the ends that you sew on, the easier it is. So if you've sewn it a bit close, you might want to unpick a little bit either side. So you can see there that this is going to actually sit flush with the quilt when I'm done. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the cutting board and give it a trim. So here's where we've joined the two together. You can either do it with the scissors or a rotary cutter. I'm going to trim it with the rotary cutter. You might find it a bit easier with a pair of scissors. And I've just trimmed it to 1/4 of an inch of where the stitch line was. And you can see that that is going to sit flush with the edge of the quilt once it's folded over. But I'm going to quickly take that over to the ironing board and press these seams open and press that flat to the quilt, and I'll come back and show you how that looks. So now that's pressed, it's all nice and neat, apart from these threads all hanging off. But then I'm going to take it to the machine and just complete the stitch line all the way around the quilt there. So now it's stitched all the way around, I can turn it over to the wrong side and turn the binding all the way around like this. So that it's ready to fold onto the wrong side. So you're then going to be folding on this edge all the way around so that it's a nice clean finished edge there. So I like to use my Wonder clips. So these are some plastic clips that you can use to pin, well, clip your work together like this. I'm going to pin all the way around. When I get to the corners, let's see if I can get this closer to the camera. So when I get to the corner, I want it to be a nice mitered corner, so I fold it like so, and then I pinch that little bit there and then fold it back on it itself. I'm just trying to tuck any excess threads into underneath, and then you end up with a nice mitered corner like so, and I'll pin that together. So I'm going to pin all the way around, ready for hand sewing. So there we are, we're all pinned, ready to hand sew, and I'll show you now how I hand sew the binding on the back. So we're all ready to hand sew. I've threaded my needle with some cream thread which matches my backing. I always cut my thread a bit too long really, so you really should only have it about the length of your hand to your elbow, and I'm just making a quilter's knot there. There we go. So it doesn't really matter where you start on your backing. I just thought I'd show you how I sew the corner as well as just down the side. So I go into the actual quilt where you want it to meet, and then I poke my needle out and then through so that it just comes out through the edge of the binding. But you want it to go into the binding and then sort of along a little bit so that you've got quite a bit of your thread is catching into the binding, if that makes sense. So you're doing a sort of invisible stitch here, like so. You could try and do this by machine from the front if you'd like to, but I always think you get a better finish if you do it by hand. So when you get to the corner, I'll just make sure that this is as neat as possible before I get into there. Put my thumb in place to keep it where I want it. So I put a couple of stitches in the corner there just to make sure it really stays in place, and then I start working down this side. So there we are, that's how I do my binding. I'm going to get on with doing my hand stitching on the back of this now. If you want to see the tutorial for how I did this advent calendar, you can see that the link in the down bar below. If you want to see more, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and you can click the little bell if you want to have notifications for the next time I upload a video. So happy crafting, and I shall see you next week. Bye!